My name is Jeronimo Silva. I'm 18 years old. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, but I was raised here in Buffalo. My family immigrated here 15 years ago now with my father, my mother, my older sister, and my younger brother. My family left Colombia seeking asylum, fleeing the political violence that's been going on since the 1960s. The conflict between the government and communist guerrillas targeted especially my mother's side of the family, my grandfather being assassinated 30 years ago now. My grandfather was an activist for the peasant farmers, and he was organizing to try and resist the opposement of guerrillas with forceful harvesting of coca, which is the main the supply line financially for most of the guerrillas' operations. They would often go to the countryside, force farmers, often kidnap their children, recruit them forcefully into the guerrilla, and basically just take their land and force them to harvest for their economic gain. And yeah, that violence constantly, persisted even after my grandfather's death. The constant threat, the fear of violence was always sort of looming over, my mom's side of the family. So originally, when we were leaving Colombia, we were intending on going to Canada to make our asylum case. However, to get there, we had flown from Bogota to New York City, taking a shuttle from New York City to Buffalo. And in Buffalo, we were supposed to only stay for about 3 days and then cross the border. However, at the time when we were traveling, my mother was pregnant with my younger brother at about 5 months, 4 or 5 months. And just as we were in Buffalo, my mother went into labor and my brother was born premature. It just heavily affected the trajectory of our entire family's lives. Just that sheer coincidence of him having been born in that moment while we were in Buffalo, sort of set up the rest of our lives here in the United States. It sort of forced us to stay here. My brother was hospitalized for the first year of his life. His health conditions were pretty severe. He was nearly blind. His lungs nearly gave out within the first few weeks of his life. The doctors gave my brother basically a 0% chance of making it past his first year. Thankfully, it's all worked out. He's gonna be bigger than me. Thankfully that worked out at least on that side of things. But the effect of that was our family ended up settling here in Buffalo as my father went out to try and find a way to support our family. Just finding basically any opportunity he could, any job he could find. Took several years before he actually got into carpentry, which is what he specializes in now, which is really what the family business is sort of geared around. Just renovating rundown houses, in the west side of Buffalo, and then, renovating them, renting them out. That's sort of like the dynamic that's taken it, and it's sort of given my parents the success, sort of, I guess, that success you could say in real estate. There's a lot of differences between here in Buffalo and back in Colombia. From the few experiences that I've had going back, the interactions that I've had speaking with my father about his experience growing up in Colombia, my grandfather, it's really two different worlds. I would say there's just a lot of privileges that I would say that I had, especially comparing it to my father's side of the family, who grew up in a very rural town of 5,000 people, really just a line of peasant farmers all the way back, as far back as records go. Yeah, just the difference between growing up here in Buffalo and what it must have been growing up in Colombia for my parents. At least on the surface level, I could say my experience is much more relatable to my mom, who grew up in Bogota in an urban setting. She grew up with the same access to, I'd say, most commodities that I had access to. My father's experience growing up living in Colombia represents a much more average experience. My father's side of the family are from a town in the department of Caldas, one of the second smallest department in Colombia, very mountainous, very heavily focused on coffee production, coffee exports. And that's really what my father worked in most of his life before he went to Bogota for university. And 15 years later, now my parents are trying to move back, at least for half the year. I don't know, eventually, I'm sure once I'm done with school, once my brother's done with school, they're going to go back and live there permanently. I think definitely that cultural clash is one of the big factors. I know it's a big argument, it's a big point of contention, with my family, that just my mother, and to a degree my father also just they feel like they can't really fully integrate here, whether it be, I'm not sure if it's necessarily a linguistic clash or if it's a cultural clash, just like an identity clash, I don't know. But definitely my parents are looking forward to moving back to Colombia. My father in particular, who still has both his parents, both my grandparents still around. And there's, in that sense, there's also, there's so much I want to say there. Yeah, like my dad just really wants to go back and be able to, in the final years of their lives, just give them back what they give him. Because as grateful as I am for the opportunity of having been able to live here in the United States, to having lived a relatively privileged life here, my grandparents also offered the same thing to my father. My grandparents, having been peasant farmers their whole lives, just having their son be able to go to university, and this would have been in the 90s, that alone was already an incredible achievement. And on top of that, having a son, having been able to work for him to be able to get through university without debt, and then be able to send him to the United States, that alone, like my grandparents, that is a huge accomplishment for the average Colombian family. And so now I think all these years later, now my, like the financial situation in our family's definitely stabilized. It's definitely improved significantly from when we got here. Yeah, it's really just like that sense of trying to go back, reconnect with family, and give back to it, to those that gave to us to be able to get here in the first place. And yeah, and it's definitely possible now. The same sort of fear of persecution that we felt, that my family felt when we came here, it's not absolutely gone, but it's definitely calmed down. The peace agreement signed in 2016 with the FARC guerrillas, which was the largest functional guerrillas, that was the one that targeted my mother's side of the family. They signed the peace agreement, laid down their arms. So sort of the political situation, the security situation is definitely relaxed back to a sustainable level. And I would even say, at least definitely in urban centers, and now more so it's spreading across rural regions of the country, like a sense of security comparable to here in the United States, where you don't have to worry about getting kidnapped, or at least for political reasons, in terms of the political conflict. You don't have to worry about violence in that sense. And yeah, so that now definitely I can see it, in the way my parents talk about Colombia, the passion with which they discuss just the idea of going back and being back with their family, being able to start a business there again. My father, having bought his own plot of land, to build a little cabin to basically just be as close as possible to his family, and just do what he's always loved doing, just being in the fields, which is something that's insane to me. Having grown up here in Buffalo, is like I can't imagine wanting to do that. Having experienced like just one day of just harvesting avocados was so physically like brutal, and it's just like I guess it's just a way of life, and some people just grow up with it, and it's a part of them, and they want to die with it. My grandfather's absolutely that way. He doesn't want to die in a city, in an apartment somewhere. He wants to be in the field. He wants to be with his animals. He wants to be with his land, the land that he's lived with his whole life.